Good morning, everyone. It's 10 o'clock, and so we're going to get this webcast started. I know some people are joining as I'm speaking, so hopefully that they'll continue to dial in. So, welcome to the webcast on fraud, waste, and abuse. My name is Mark Staranka, and I lead the Moss Adams team that serves as the city's internal auditor. Before we get started, I have a few protocols, some items to cover. First, today's session is being recorded. As a result, we have muted all the conference lines. You have the opportunity to ask questions during the presentation by using the WebEx Q&A feature. You'll notice it in the top right portion of your screen. There's an option to click on Q&A. Once you click there, a text box will appear at the bottom of your screen. Type your question into the text box and either hit enter or click send. Toward the end of the session, we'll do our best to cover the questions. If there's something we aren't able to get to, we'll follow up with you by email. We'll be asking polling questions throughout today's presentation per the National Association of State Boards of Accountancy Webcast CPE standards. CPE credit will be awarded based on your participation in these polls, so it's really important that you respond to the questions. As a reminder, you must answer at least 3 of the polling questions. I believe we have 4, and you must be present for at least 50 minutes of this webcast in order to receive 1 CPE credit. When polling questions open, a window will open in the bottom right of your screen. You'll be given about 30 seconds to choose your answer. Please just remember to submit, click on the submit button after choosing your answer. You have to click submit for it to register. If you're attending this webcast in a group, you'll need to complete our attendance sheet in order to receive CPE credit. To download the attendance sheet, select the third tab at the top of this session, which is entitled Attendance Record. Next, click File at the top of your screen, and then Save As, and then Document. Choose the PDF version type, and then click Save. These instructions also appear on the Event Info tab if you need to refer to them again. Please have all members of your team sign, or your group sign the attendance sheet. One form per group is acceptable. This is only necessary if you're attending in a group or sitting in another person's office and you haven't personally signed into the webcast. Otherwise, we won't be able to identify you. If you meet the requirements of the webcast CPE standards, we'll email you your CPE certificate within 2 weeks. As a reminder, the presentation you're about to hear is not legal or accounting advice. We encourage you to seek the services of a professional service provider to apply this content to your specific circumstances. And before I introduce our presenter, I just wanted to mention this particular training webinar is part of the city's overall internal audit program. It was one of the offerings that there was strong interest in starting to up-level the overall understanding of fraud, waste, and abuse throughout the city. Some of this has already occurred at the management level of the organization, and this is an opportunity to reach out to all employees. So without further ado, I'm very pleased to introduce Gina St. George, who will be our presenter. She's a senior manager with Moss Adams and has over 25 years of operational and public accounting experience. She performs a variety of auditing, financial reporting, and compliance engagements, in addition to developing and implementing operational and accounting internal controls. She also provides internal and external training on fraud detection and prevention, our topics today, and she performs forensic accounting engagements for a wide range of clients across the industries we serve. So, without further ado, over to you, Gina.
Thank you, Mark. It's great to be here today. I'm glad to be here. Like Mark said, I am a certified fraud examiner, so I hate to say it, but business is really good right now. So that's part of the reason the city took the proactive effort to say, hey, I think we need to do something about that. So they're definitely doing their best practices, and this training is part of that. So today we're going to be talking about fraud's impacts, defining fraud, waste, and abuse, looking at how fraud can occur, what kind of environment is needed to commit fraud, recognizing the red flags of fraud, and talking about how you fit into this overall picture of the fraud, waste, and abuse program and what you can do. So to start with, I want to talk about the impact of fraud on organizations in general. So from this lovely magazine article, or newspaper article thing, the internet's wonderful, right? You can make newspaper things from anything. So although this newspaper article has been reformatted for this presentation, it's not a real article, the name of the employees have been changed. So this is a real-life headline of a fraud that occurred in a city in California. So this is Bell, California. And Bell is a city just outside LA County. It's about 2.5 square miles. It has a population of around 35,000 people. And it was incorporated back in 1927, like a nice small little town. But something happened about 10 years ago. They got charter status. And what is charter? Well, in the state of California, it meant that the city officials were exempt from any state salary caps. Now, a little over 2 years ago, a California jury found that a former administrative officer was guilty of a massive public corruption scheme to boost her pay, her boss's pay. Her boss got up to $1 million. She only got like 500, so I don't know why she did that. But she was writing her own employment contracts, taking loans out without council approval, removing public documents, and creating her own retirement plan. Now, that retirement plan would have cost the taxpayers $8 million if she would not have been stopped. So that's a substantial impact on such a small city. And this is actually one of the smallest cities in the country by size. Yet the financial damage caused would be felt, I mean, it's going to be felt for years to come. It's really hard to imagine a fraud of this magnitude with employees making six-figure incomes. But unfortunately, small-scale frauds are committed quite frequently. In fact, governments such as Carson City are highly susceptible to fraud. Based upon studies by the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners who look at actual cases, it takes up to 18 months to detect the average case, and the losses for governments are about $100,000 per incident. And governments have limited revenues, which, to be used for the citizens. Yet far too often, employees are damaging their own lives at the expense of fellow taxpayers. And part of my mission in life is to help protect employees too, because it's very sad to see what happens to a person's life when they become a victim of fraud by committing it. So, but really, fraud's not just in government, it's everywhere. Right now I have active investigations in a hospital, a homeowners association, I do have a government, and a couple hotels. Now in the hotel situation, they're choosing to be proactive and hiring us as internal auditors, similar to the city. So a lot more people are being proactive and identifying fraud. But why is fraud everywhere? And how and why does it happen, and what could you do to help stop it? So I'm going to attempt to answer those questions, but let's first talk about fraud, waste, and abuse. They all have something in common, a loss of some kind, but they are distinctly different, and it's important to know the difference and learn to recognize the signs so that you can join the fight against fraud, waste, and abuse. So fraud defined. Now this is a dishonest, it's a very deliberate act. Think of it as something where you stole something, but you're trying to deceive, trying to cover it up in some fashion. You're intentionally misleading. It's very deceitful. And one of the main things is that it's depriving another of its resources, such as the city. Now there's different types of fraud. There's three main categories. There could be financial statement fraud because we're hiding something. Or it could be misappropriation of assets, stealing cash, equipment, those types of things, or corruption. So these are examples of fraud, and that would be the highest level. Now waste is something different. Waste is needless, it's careless, it doesn't involve necessarily personal gain, it's just not looking out for the best interest of the company. Purchasing supplies a little bit extra that we don't need. Let's say we have to, spend all our money for a grant so we can get more next year. That would be wasteful. And it's almost always signifies poor management decisions, poor practices, poor controls. So even though you might see something that that looks like vagrantly wrong, it may not be fraud. It could just be waste. So it's important to understand the difference there. Now, abuse. Now, that doesn't involve fraud. It doesn't rise to that level, but it'd be somebody who's taking their position and in using improper use. It's wrongful, it's intentional, but it's based on their position of power, not necessarily a fraud. So that takes us to our first polling question. So let's say you come home from work and there's crumbs on the counter and half the cookies are missing from the cookie jar. Only your 8-year-old son and spouse are at home. And these cookies were supposed to be for a meeting that evening. So what do you think? Is this a case of fraud, waste, or abuse? And Stephanie, are we going to open up the polling question?
The polling question is now open. Thanks.
Yay, okay. So go ahead and submit. Again, this is the cookie jar caper here. I'd like to find out, do you think this is a case of fraud, waste, abuse, or just not sure? So give another couple seconds here. Okay, Stephanie, should we go ahead and close the polling questions?
Okay, the polling question is closed.
Okay, can't quite see the answers yet and where we're headed, but I wanted to go through this. So really, I'm not sure if we know which one it is. So I think a lot of people, not sure, no answer. Because let's say with fraud, there probably would have been some kind of cover-up. Maybe I asked my son, hey, did you take the cookies from the cookie jar? And he's got crumbs all over his face, his fingers are sticky, and he lies and says, oh, no, I didn't take the cookies. So that's this intentional cover-up. So that would definitely be fraud. Let's say I opened up the garbage can, and I see a little bite out of each cookie, and he's throwing it away. He just wanted that fresh bite, and then he's throwing in the garbage. That would be definitely waste. And then what about abuse? Well, let's say I went to my spouse, who's the leader of the house, and just asked him, hey, do you know who took the cookies? And he just automatically dismisses it and blames the son because he has that position of power. So in this particular case, we're really not sure. And don't forget, just because something looks suspicious, everyone is innocent until the evidence suggests otherwise. You know, for all we know, that housekeeper may have come in and taken all the cookies. So we want to make sure that even though we see evidence of fraud or something happening, and if you do report it to through the fraud hotline, you may not have all the facts. So now let's go into the fraud environment itself. So there's a number of things required to help create this environment where fraud, waste, or abuse can occur. The first is opportunity. Either a position of authority or access to assets such as cash or equipment. Without an opportunity, fraud is less likely, which is why segregation of duties is so important, and having checks and balances, right? If people don't have the opportunity, it's much harder to take anything. So the next is incentive. So imagine if you had a sick child, or your car broke down, or you didn't have the money to care for your family or even get to work. Now that's pretty good incentive. Now if you also have access to the assets, now you have incentive and opportunity. But anytime you have incentive opportunity, that doesn't mean you're going to steal, right, or commit fraud. You have to have that rationalization. So let's say, well, we buy tons of paper and waste it all the time. It won't matter if I take a few reams and print some up on my personal business and print up flyers. So that's actually taking company assets, using equipment of the company for your own personal benefit. Now, let's say you haven't got a raise and I deserve one. I'll just consider whatever I take to be a part of my salary. So rationalization is a very powerful tool in the fraud environment. So when you have all these three together, that makes a very risky fraud environment. So we've touched on a few different types of fraud, but let's get into a little more of the details. So these are the top schemes in government, and this again is as reported by the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners. So that top one there, this one is corruption, and that really ties into our first story on the city of Bell, California. It's really the perfect example. Corruption is dishonest activity in which a person acts contrary to the interests of the city and abuses their position of trust in order to achieve personal advantage for themselves or another party. So conflicts of interest. Let's say I'm a purchasing person and I procure out for some goods and services, and it just happens to be awarded to my brother-in-law. So is that necessarily fraud? No, but let's say I lied and there's a conflict of interest policy and I didn't disclose the fact that this was my brother-in-law. We want to make sure things are done on an arm's length transaction. Just disclose this thing. So you don't want to be perceived as covering up anything. Now, it could rise to the level of corruption if that was the only person that got a chance to bid and they're the only one that got the contract. It was set up in a way for only them to get it. So that would be more of a cover-up scheme. And then another example of corruption would be bribes or kickbacks, those type of things for getting awarded a contract. But there's also some areas where non-cash, right? We had the corruption here, billing. Billing has to do with cash, like leaving the bank or something. But the third one there is actually non-cash. So there's a lot of equipment in a city. We've got computer equipment, heavy equipment, those types of things. Now, equipment can either be stolen outright or be used for personal gain. So either way, that would be considered fraud. So here's that example of like corruption or collusion, bid rigging and price fixing. These are all opportunities for someone, if someone wasn't monitoring their activities, fraud could be permitted. And that's really why we have this internal audit function. This monitoring environment, it helps to actually protect the employees, because if people think they're not going to get caught, they're more likely to commit fraud as well. So we always want to have checks and balance, people monitoring each other, people checking people. So in payments that leave the entity, there are instances where employees have paid themselves, just outright check to themselves, paid their own personal expenses, or falsified payroll records to obtain reimbursements and funds. So these are all examples of fraud as well. So check tampering, that still occurs. I had one case at a government where I was searching their office, and sure enough, I opened up a drawer, and there I saw my smoking gun. It was a perfect check. It was very heavy pen print over and over and over and again, and practicing the signature over and over and over again. And sure enough, multitude of checks that were fraudulently signed. So fraud's not always that easy, but with the check tampering, it can be quite simple. People still commit a lot of fraud with the checks. But expense accounts, it's another area where fraud can occur. Anytime a payment or reimbursement occurs, that's an opportunity point to rationalize a need or a want. So now we're on to our second polling question. So what creates a risky fraud environment? Is it incentive, opportunity, rationalization, or all of the above? Give people about 10 more seconds.
And remember to click both your answer and the submit button.
Okay, so why don't we go ahead and close down the polling question, see what we have. Wow, what a great audience here. We got all of the above, 100% right, so good job. So the red flags of fraud. we've talked a lot about, the evidence, right? I gave you different examples of fraud. But there's a lot more to red flags than the processes and schemes and all those kind of things. Before I got into basically the fraud business, I didn't realize it was such a people business, right? Because it's not the evidence that commits fraud, it's the people that commit fraud. And what's left behind is important, but there's a lot of red flags in the people. So when I start a fraud investigation, I start to ask, and sure enough, always these red flags keep popping up. So we want to have a chance to talk about them. And going back to the cookie jar case, if I had a knowledge about these people, what if my spouse was on a strict diet and maybe he decided to break the diet, or my son had a history of sneaking food? Those would be red flags that would help me with the investigation, to have knowledge about the people involved. So if you want to be a fraud fighter, what should you look for? So unfortunately, the characteristics of a fraudster are not on the surface. They look just like you and me. So in fact, statistics show at least like 30% of the audience may have committed fraud at one time. So unfortunately, it is rampant out there. But what can you do? So here's some characteristics of an employee fraudster. They might be a hard worker. Maybe they're a rule breaker. Big spender. If I'm inviting people out, buying them drinks, that type of thing, wanting to give back to my fellow employees, that could be hiding the fact that I'm actually stealing from my employer and I want to share the wealth, so without actually telling people that. Another characteristic would be a sudden change in behavior. Way back when, I used to be in the restaurant business, and I was a restaurant manager. So of course, I wasn't a certified fraud examiner back then, but if I would have known then what I know now, there was 2 different employees who got terminated, and both of them are found out how they were committing fraud. But thinking back, I realized those 2 employees, they were always kind of complaining about money issues and wanting to work extra shifts and all this kind of stuff. But over time, they had gone down to only 4 shifts. They were giving away their good shifts. I didn't think about it at that time, but that was definitely a red flag. And sure enough, they had figured out a way to circumvent the POS system to commit fraud. So they were getting lots of money. They didn't need to work the extra shift. So whenever there's a change in behavior like that, that's also a red flag. So here's the top behavioral red flags of perpetrators as reported by the certified fraud examiners. So living beyond your means. So if someone is at like a supervisory level and is driving a Lamborghini, you might question, hey, where'd they get that money? So that's a typical evidence. Maybe they're having financial difficulties. They have control issues. They don't want anybody else to do their work. They're unusually close to vendors or customers. Oh, no, I'll take that check to them. I need to talk to them. Maybe they have a wheeler-dealer attitude, circumventing the rules, that type of thing. Also, divorce or family problems. Unfortunately, that's a red flag. Getting very defensive when people ask them questions. Addiction problems. Unfortunately, drug abuse creates a great incentive for fraud because you need capital to move forward. And then refusal to take vacations. They don't want anybody in their area to catch what they're doing. So these are all the top red flags of fraud. So what about the position of the fraudster? Now, you can see here the managers and executive. Why is it then an executive level that the amount would be higher and the months to detect higher? Well, they're the ones who are supposed to be monitoring controls, or they have the power to circumvent controls or tell people, oh, no, we don't need to do that. So the higher up in executive power, the larger the median loss because they have more access. And what about the department? Unfortunately, I as an accountant, I hate seeing accounting at the top of the list, but, we have the opportunity. We have the access to the cash. The cash in the bank, the wire transfers, that's a lot there. The next would be operations. So operations has access to inventory, those types of things. but you can see that every department really is involved in this whole fraud act. So here's our third polling question. Which items is a behavioral red flag of a fraudster? Number 1, we have frequent vacations. Number 2, happily married. Number 3, gambling problem. And number 4, loves to delegate. So what do you think? Give people about 10 more seconds here. Gives me a chance to drink some water as well. Okay, why don't we go ahead and close down the polling question? Let's see what we have. Okay, so I'm not sure if everybody can see the polling answers, but let's see. 23% didn't answer, but those who did answer said gambling problem, so very good. Gambling, unfortunately, I do audit casinos as well, and so I have a little Google app that says casino and fraud, so it sends me a little alerts once a week. Most of the time, the alerts that I get are somebody is stealing from their company and spending the money at the casino. So gambling problem, unfortunately, is a very big indicator there of fraud if you have an addiction problem like that. But going to frequent vacations, I did have a case where somebody stole $500,000 from a hotel, and he was taking frequent vacations. And he would be calling in sick on Mondays and Fridays and be jetting off all over the United States going on these vacations. Some he told his employer about, some he didn't. In this particular case, I used social media to track when he was emailing his employer to saying, hey, I'm homesick today. He was actually in Vegas, and he was posting pictures and doing all these kind of things. So technology has made the fraud fight a little bit better there, but frequent vacations can also be an indicator. Where did they get the money for those vacations? So let's go on to the Fraud, Waste, and Abuse program. This is your program. So what we have is the fraud hotline. We're going to walk through how it works a little bit, talk about the whistleblower protection that's involved. So the fraud hotline, this is your opportunity. When you see any type of fraud, or maybe you're just not sure, this is your opportunity to report it. Now you can either do it through a toll-free telephone line. There's a website that you can go on to. This Lighthouse Services, that's an anonymous method. If you do the email route to internalauditor@carson.org, that one is not as confidential. But of course, if you do use that, we will try to protect your anonymity, but it would be best to use the Lighthouse one. So there's different things that is available on the website. So if you were to go in and log in, so it's not just all about fraud. There's drop-down categories. You can report abuse of benefits. Maybe there's accounting, auditing, or internal control, finance controls you'd like to report. Maybe a code of ethics violation, conflict of interest. There's even a spot for customer service failures, discrimination, embezzlement, falsifying of records, theft of property. Maybe there's time abuse, unusual or suspicious activity. You just don't know, you just want to report something. And then waste and abuse, as we talked about. And then you also have the opportunity, would you be willing to anonymously further assist if asked? So how can you report and still be anonymous, right? Well, there's actually a third-party intermediary. So they will gather your information, they keep it, and they allow you to communicate with the city or the internal auditors anonymously. If you do want to talk to someone, though, that's always an option, and you can give permission online as well. So here's how you would submit an incident report. So click on there, and you can even follow up on a previous report. Now, are you going to get a full report of what you reported? Well, no. Remember, you're reporting something. Somebody's innocent until proven guilty. There's an investigation. There's some confidentiality reasons there, but you could follow up to find out, what are the steps involved? Was it move forward or not? So, as the internal auditor for the city, we actually get the messages from the lighthouse, and from there we take it from there. So it actually never goes directly to the city. Now, does that mean that you can't go to HR or report or anything like that? No. I mean, you can still do that, but we're just offering this anonymous method to move forward. So Lighthouse is independent. It's to protect you. Also, those investigations are submitted to Lighthouse to the company's designee, which is Moss Adams, and you may not have an investigation solely on that. Let's say we don't get enough evidence. It's really hard to investigate something. If we didn't get enough details, it makes it hard to move forward. So there are circumstances where we wouldn't be able to unless you left information for us to contact you anonymously. So I'd highly encourage you to do that. So, but there is a disclaimer. Although we will not disclose your identity without your express permission, it is possible that your identity may be discovered during investigation of the matter of report. Let's say you report something and you're in that department. Well, we're going to come in and talk to everybody, right? So you may be offering more information, not necessarily disclosing your entity, but you may be involved in the investigation. So would you be willing to anonymously assist if further asked? So it does ask you that after you submit. You do have the opportunity to give your email address. If you are concerned, don't give your personal email address. Make up a fake email address and put that in, and that way, not fake, but one that doesn't identify you, and then you can really communicate anonymously as well. So providing your email address can facilitate an anonymous dialogue, so that's really what we're going for. And the city will never see your email address either way. So what is the protection for you? So the state's fraud policy includes whistleblower protection and prohibits retribution against any employee who may have a report or suspected inappropriate activity. And there's also in protection for the employee. So the city will take each call seriously and investigate as the issue warrants and evidence is available. You can either do it by phone or online. So that comes to our fourth polling question. So how do you report fraud, waste, or abuse? Do you post it on Facebook? I mean, social media, that'll make everybody find out, right? Make an appointment with Human Resources, go to the website link, or tell my coworker. What's the best way to report fraud, waste, or abuse? Hit 10 more seconds here. And don't forget to hit the submit button. So Stephanie, why don't we go ahead and close down the polls? And I'm hoping nobody picked Facebook, but I have to tell you, I actually investigated a fraud based upon a Facebook tip. So these people were wondering, gosh, why does this person keep cashing checks for the government over at the local mini-mart? Because the mini-mart was cashing checks over there. So instead of going and telling somebody, they actually posted it on Facebook, and that's how this tip started. So why are tips and your involvement in the whistleblower protection so important? Well, tips are actually the #1 way people find out about fraud, waste, and abuse. I mean, that's the top. It's not external audits. It's not internal audits. It's actually tips. And half those tips come from employees. That's why it's very important for us to get the message out to you. This fraud hotline is actually available to throughout the city as well. People can go onto the website and they can report suspected fraud as well. So tips are a very important part of the process in the fraud prevention program. So it looks like 69% plan to go to the website link. And one person says, oh, I'll make an appointment with HR. Nobody wants to tell their coworker or go on Facebook. That's probably a good thing. And then the no answer people. So I think we're off to a good track there, that now you know about the website. If you don't know where to find it, there is a fraud, waste, and abuse program, or just go right onto the Carson City website and you'll see a link there. So we've got a chance to talk about fraud, waste, and abuse defined, the different categories of fraud, some of the benefits of the fraud, waste, and abuse program. It not only keeps Carson City out of the paper. You don't want to be like that other city. It used to be a newspaper came out, you hit the papers, and it disappeared. Well, nowadays these things don't disappear. They stay on the internet forever. So we want to keep out of the paper, but also want to protect you as the employee from getting in a position of opportunity, incentive, or rationalization where you would commit fraud. So your role is to go out and look for red flags. You're not going to be fraud investigators. You don't have to investigate anything, just to report the tip. That's where we take over and investigate those. And then, of course, whistleblower protection. We want to let you know that you are protected if you do provide a tip. So I do believe we have some time for questions if you'd like to submit them.
And this is Mark and Gina. Well, hopefully we get a few questions submitted. I thought maybe what we could do is also just talk about sort of the generically some of the fraud, waste, and abuse cases, engagements that we're working on now. And as an example, there's sort of three that we're currently working on in the governmental arena that at our different stages. One's actually a preventative stage. It was just at a tribal government yesterday, and the discussion there was focused on, and this is kind of going to be the theme of three examples, is development of policies and procedures. And this is coming from the council level and their level of concern that not having sufficient policies and procedures in place gives them discomfort that the tribal government is doing things consistently across the organization, above board across the organization, and I know from management perspective, they're feeling like the council's micromanaging, but there's this bridge between the two that doesn't exist, or doesn't exist to the extent that it could and should, which are policies and procedures. And while they in themselves, of course, don't prevent fraud, waste, and abuse, they give you, a roadmap for the things you would do to not operate in that manner. As I mentioned, that's kind of a common theme to activities, projects that we have going on now, one with a college, it's actually a tribal college, and one with a city. Neither is there necessarily fraud, waste, and abuse involved, and in fact we don't know yet, but in both cases the situation is that there's a concern that has occurred, and why the concern exists is because there's, in one case, there are financial concerns that are a driving factor, but in both cases there's a fairly extreme lack of, first, policies and procedures, and second, documentation. And so when you go to try to look at why there were mistakes in payroll, where is the backup for purchases, were the right purchasing mechanisms used, i.e. the right policies and procedures, if they exist, used, were we doing contracting for professional services in the right manner, where we're using internal and external resources and paying them at the right rates, done. And what happens is happening in these cases is there's a lack of that information, in either towards guiding how to do it or documentation of how it was done. Now, both of those will help in terms of preventing and detecting fraud, but a lack of them, or in a way a lack of transparency, creates, you know, the concern, sort of the vacuum that is, okay, well, we don't know, and especially in a case where, in reality, in both cases where their financial performance has been a concern, then what were the drivers of the financial performance, and maybe there was nothing at all that was fraudulent, wasteful, or abusive, but the question is, or the reason the question exists is because there are doubts, because the base information isn't there. I think I've killed enough time because a couple of questions have come in. Can you see those, Gina?
Yeah. Well, you know, as far as how long this process is in place and has anyone reported through the website, I'm not sure the exact date that the fraud hotline came on board. I know that things have been reported and investigated. Mark, do you want to elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, I'm going to forget the exact timing too, but I'll say that it's been, give or take, about a year, or maybe just shy of a year, and we have had, I'll say, a handful of what they call incident reports coming in through the fraud hotline, or the ethics hotline as it's called in some entities, and the vast majority have not been something that rises to the level of fraud, waste, or abuse. And by the policies that were put in place under the internal audit program relative to the fraud hotline, there's sort of a dissemination process of information that doesn't rise to the level of fraud, waste, or abuse, i.e., for example, something that gets forwarded to HR for a personnel issue that's not fraud, waste, or abuse, or there have been examples of community members having an issue with something that they used the hotline as their mechanism to communicate it, and that information was forwarded to the appropriate people within the city because it wasn't, again, a case of fraud, waste, or abuse. And I would say from our experience in the other cities that we play this role in, where there's a fraud hotline, that the majority don't end up being fraud, waste, or abuse, which actually that's a good thing, and few of them are what I would consider a misuse of the hotline, meaning there aren't things that are just silly. There are concerns. They don't happen to rise to fraud, waste, or abuse, and that's okay. You know, the person making the report doesn't necessarily, you know, have the definitions memorized and know exactly, but the mechanism of the hotline has sort of served its purpose of it provided a conduit, and that information went to the appropriate parties. So we've had across cities some reports certainly that do rise to fraud, waste, and abuse, but thankfully that's the minority of the case.
So there is a question here on our work computers can be monitored. If we use our work computer, is there a block so that it can be traced to us, or should we use our own? If you're that concerned about it, I would probably use your home computer. I don't think anybody's going to dive in and do an investigation down to your computer because we have that conduit involved. It would be very difficult for the city to find out, because if you're using your computer reporting to Lighthouse, Lighthouse is not going to share that information. So I think you're protected there, but if you're really uncomfortable, you can go ahead and use your home computer. And then there was another question regarding just the CPE. If you don't have a CPE requirement, if you don't need it, you don't have to download that attendance record unless it was a requirement for the city to show that you've attended. So there might be a city requirement to show you attended. If you have problems with that attendance record, I think that people are having a hard time with that, let us know and we will get that out to you. I'm looking through the rest of the questions. I think I answered them.
Gina, can you think of another appropriate example of something current or recent in terms of in the governmental arena, or it doesn't even necessarily need to be governmental, to sort of just share as an example whether, something that we looked at that whether or not it turned out to be fraud, waste, or abuse, but circumstances?
I'm actually investigating a hospital, and it's getting state funding. So there was evidence where there was poor internal controls over the credit card used by the CEO. There was instances where he was taking his credit card and using it for personal expenses, and then he was reimbursing them, right? So maybe he went on a trip with his wife, and he would write a check to cover the cost of her trip. Because of the lack of internal controls, getting receipts, that type of thing, and it is a state-funded hospital, they had a requirement to do their due diligence and investigate that even further. That's at that point that I came in as a forensic investigator. And since I'm happy to report that we cross-referenced his travel log, receipts, those types of things to his Outlook calendar to show that, yes, he was out on business-related trips. If it was he had PTO on his calendar, those were items that he did reimburse for. So through this investigation, we are going to be able to exonerate him from any allegations. So it's not that we always go in and we assume people are guilty. We're going to want to assume that they are innocent until proven guilty. So that's one of the benefits of having qualified people go in and do the investigation. They're not biased in any way. They're independent, and they just want to know the truth, what's out there. So that's one example. Let's see. There's another example where we're going to be doing that homeowners association. So that's where, it's almost like in the city where people have this outside party kind of looking in at the inner workings of the city, right? So they really don't understand what's going on. They're just seeing evidence. They're seeing their own red flags. So they're calling in or they're contacting an investigator to say, hey, go in and investigate there. So that's an interesting environment to be in because an external party's kind of picking up on red flags. So that's going to be an interesting approach that we take, going in, obtaining all the documents. There's allegations of the manager of the homeowners association basically overcharging the home ownership and hiring related parties for snow removal when they haven't had a lot of snow lately. So we're going to be looking at definitely some corruption and collusion and those types of things in that instance. So very similar to a lot of the stuff that happens in a city environment where people are granting contracts and those types of things. So definitely keeping busy on the fraud front.
And I would just add, and many of you may have heard or seen, the city of Pasadena had a large fraud situation, I think on the order of about $6 million, and those cases, of course, aren't the norm, and that's kind of a segue to so that really in a way the context for this webinar and this topic, this is not being provided because there's a concern that there's fraud, waste, and abuse at Carson City. It's not being given because we want everyone on high alert and looking each day for trying to find fraud, waste, and abuse, and stimulating a whole lot of activity in that regard. It's being provided as it should be as a best practice, and it's just building awareness, building understanding. It's an area that, like internal controls, that we're all doing our jobs day to day, and we probably all assume, in a way rightfully so, that these activities don't occur, and give folks the benefit of the doubt, which I would hope we would. But in fact, this stuff does occur, and it does occur more than we probably all think that it does. And so just having that better awareness, that level of just being able to be attuned to it a little bit as we're doing our things, and in a way also just giving ourselves sort of a good reference point. Not that, of course, we would probably any of us, commit fraud, but sometimes we could do things that are wasteful, certainly, as Gina talked about earlier, and just, sort of having that mindset a little bit of, oh, where am I doing something that's bordering on that? And so, again, really the context is it's a best practice. There isn't this part of the internal audit program just for that reason. It's a good thing to touch upon every once in a while. Hadn't really been an area of focus at the city other than providing the hotline. And so then you have the hotline, and just like one of the questions is great, have we even had any reports? It's, why bother have a hotline if you sort of don't know that A, it exists, and B, what its true purpose is. And, again, this information just helps to create a context and, a little bit more awareness of these types of activities, and just to be alert to them. Any other, I'm sorry, go ahead, Gina.
Yeah, we do have another question. Do you recommend we go through our HR department as well as the website when reporting fraud or abuse? I'd probably just stick with the website. If you're going to go ahead and report through that mechanism, because you don't want to have two different investigations going on. Sometimes things that you're going to report may not necessarily be appropriate for HR at that point. But if it is definitely kind of like clear-cut HR related, you want to make an appointment with them, feel free to do that. But probably start with one and then see how far you get and then go to the other. But going through the fraud hotline would be fine, because what happens is it gets reported to us, and we kind of go through our criteria to say, does this fall within a fraud, waste, and abuse, or is it more HR related? So it will eventually get to HR if it is HR type information. So rest assured that that's the process we go through.
Great, good question. Any remaining questions?
I think that was all the questions that we had.
Okay, great.
So I guess we can kind of wrap it up a little bit. I hope that if you haven't yet visited the website, to go ahead and take a look at that and find out more about the whistleblower protections, the confidentiality. And then think about the presentation today, looking for those red flags of their suspicious behavior with fellow employees, or maybe with vendors, things that just don't feel comfortable to you. Now you have this anonymous mechanism. So if you feel uncomfortable in any way, now you can just anonymously report it. You don't have to have all the facts and circumstances necessarily. But for instance, if 5 different people kind of feel uncomfortable about a situation, they only may have one piece of the puzzle. But if all 5 people report, that helps get a bigger piece of the puzzle. So feel free to report. So that's probably best practice.
And just maybe add in conclusion that this webinar was recorded, and the reason it was recorded so that it can be played back in the future for primarily for other employees at Carson City, because of course we knew not everyone would be able to attend all at the same time this webinar. And of course, you could go back. We'll provide, obviously, information, a link to where this webinar can be accessed in the future, should you want to, although probably unlikely, refer to this in the future. You'll obviously be able to do that also in terms of that link once that information is provided. But again, the primary purpose is so that other employees within the city can go through this in a recorded fashion at their leisure. So I think with that, we appreciate your attendance. I see that we just flashed up the record of attendance there. If you were needing that document because you were in a group, you could always just take a screenshot of that and print it. And there's an email address provided, Katie Soderberg with Moss Adams, up towards the top. just complete that and email that to Katie. Again, and I'm just kind of buying you a little bit of time. Again, if you need that, just take a screenshot of your computer. And I think with that, I'll say for the final time, thank you. Appreciate you attending. Have a great rest of the day. Thank you.
Thanks.